Many of you are very familiar and know General Doug very well. A background in Melbourne University Regiment, 5th, 6th Battalion and 8th, 7th Battalion of the Royal Victorian Regiment, operational service in East Timor and our region, commanded one of those battalions that I've just mentioned, and also was the commander of 4 Brigade, of course, and led a bushfire response in 2019, received a member of the Order of Australia for that work. He, as General Fox indicated, has been the head of Joint Support Services Division and then has now moved across to be the inaugural head of Reserves and Cadet Support Division. And together with Air Vice Marshal Steve Meredith has headed up the Reserve Strategic Review. In civil life, Doug is a busy barrister who practices in Melbourne, but of course he's taken time out from that legal practice in order to be the person he is today. So without further ado, to talk about the Reserve Strategic Review, thanks Doug.
All right. Hi, well, still good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Could I say up front, obviously this morning I'll be presenting on some themes of the strategic review of the ADF Reserve. As General Fox mentioned, I'd like you to respect the fact that this is all pre-decisional. So the report is across the lake, as we say in the bubble, and is with government at the moment. But they haven't made a decision on the recommendations. So what I'll present to you today is a little bit close hold, not the sort of thing I particularly want necessarily outside of this community for the time being, until government makes a decision about it and we get our marching orders to crack on. Can I also pause to thank both Rusi here that I was able to present to in the running of the doing of the review, but also to Michael, you and the executive for the engagement I've been able to have with the DRA, to receive your views and to back brief you as we've gone along on that journey. I think that's a really healthy sign that we're able to have that engagement at that level and certainly to take your views and understand how that can fit into what we're after. And even to the extent of if there was something advanced that didn't fit in, to have the discussion as to why not, I thought was a useful thing. So with that preamble, I will canter through a little bit some themes of the review, the conceptual stuff that we've kind of arrived at, and then be prepared to repel borders when we get to the end of that. All right, so the terms of reference. The reason why I've thrown the terms of reference up there is because I was very heartened to see that government in no way clipped our wings in terms of what we were to look out at in terms of the review. Those terms of reference, those words, are almost directly drawn out of the Defence Strategic Review itself, which required us to get after all of those things. And some of them are very challenging. So, you know, if you're looking at preparedness and scaling, you know, in the concept of, you know, what's the reserve meant to do in terms of contributing to defence outputs, that's about as strategic as you get. You're right there at the point of, you know, considering how the effects would be marshalled, what mobilisation might look like, what effects do we need. That very much, you know, stem back and design the whole train set, including, you know, our contribution as the reserve. So very heartened that we had that breadth to look at. In terms of the journey that we went on, so we really got our marching orders pretty well just at the end of last year, and then of course you go into stand down and not much happens over Christmas. So we tried to hit the ground running in January with engagement broadly across the ADF, but also other agencies and other, for example, the DRA and RUSI that have views as well. Our oversight came from COSC, who we back briefed on at a number of points in the journey, and then ultimately through Defence Committee to approve the report and hand it off to government, which we concluded at the end of last month. and it, as I said, is currently with government. Some observations about ADF reserve today. I might have got a little bit myself in trouble when I briefed the DRA executive, and I might have perhaps gilded the lily a bit by saying that if you were to step back and look at the reserve, you might be forgiven for thinking it's not the product of intelligent design, and I think General Irving took me to task over that. But I would say that if park the 2nd Australian Division, right, in a good place, but if you step back and look at across 5 domains, how have we got our reserve forces configured? What are they meant to do? How are they contributing? That's what I mean by an absence of a deliberate system design that creates an ADF reserve effect that kind of makes sense. And look, you would know intuitively that particularly in the Navy and Air Force spaces, we have a reserve contribution that is now entirely derived of, almost entirely derived of ex-Circat 7 permanent force folk, a lot of whom are backfilling in the organisation, providing excellent business continuity for permanent force organisations. You saw CPERS's chart around the age demographics across the different services, and you can see from that too how, particularly in those services, at the end of their full-time career as a Circat 7, it's not uncommon at all for them to transition, come back in as a Circat 3 to a job that they want to do. And there are probably about 3,000 Circat 3 in the system that are providing more than 100 days a year service. And of those, about 2,000 of them are of that type. So ex-permanent force, probably got their pension, able to come back and do some reserve days of their choosing. And as you'll see as a theme a bit later, whilst that's not something we don't want to sustain and continue, we do because they're providing great effect, but it's not terribly well organised at the moment. It's done on a somewhat haphazard basis with people applying for jobs that they want to do because of who they know or they've done it before, or being sought after by mates who want to bring someone back in. All great, but where's the enterprise vote in where that workforce is going, where that dollar spend is being spent? Is it meeting the requirements of defence and how we get after that? And you'll see how that theme trucks through in terms of how we conceptualise what the reserve actually is, and one of the key outcomes in terms of how we need to do more in the career and personal management space. I won't dwell on this. You heard it from CPERS. You all know it. That there is competition for workforce at the moment. You should be heartened that the growth figures are there, and I think the retention figures too for the reserve generally at the moment. So that is certainly good news. One of the things that we're asked to look at specifically is the Ready Reserve scheme that finished in the mid to late 90s. But my number one observation about that is people's views on that and its utility depend on where they were in the organisation when it happened. So if you're General Tomei and you had a great time leading some of those soldiers and taking them on operations, you're probably going to think it's a great idea. If you were somewhere else where you counted the beans and were worried about return on investment, you might not think it was a good idea. So I don't think there was any black or white answer to whether it was of itself a good idea or whether it was allowed to get to the full maturity of what it could have been. But there were some poignant lessons to come out of it that were worth noting. One of the things that the Ready Reserve scheme did was it directly targeted how you have a bit of an accelerated pathway to create a particular capability. And that as a concept, I think is worthy of taking forward in some shape or form. May not be the exact same thing as the Ready Reserve scheme per se, but the idea that you front-end load a bit, but you're directly targeting building a specific capability. But also, one of the things there is it was effectively an ADF offer. So it's it stands alone to just, enlist and join, let's say the General Reserve. This was a different pathway into service. And here, again, I'll pause to identify different philosophical approaches to this. Some people will say to me, hey, Doug, if you keep creating all these pathways, aren't you taking away a person that might have otherwise joined up full-time and gone into a CERCAT 7 position? And, you might understand where that demographic comes from. But my point is, well, I don't know that to be the case, and I don't know that the contrary is the case either, but my sense is that having multiple options of entry, multiple pathways that cater for as many different types of folk and interest as you can, seems to me to be a sensible way to maximise, choose your own adventure, an option kind of for everyone. But as I say, there is a contrary view that, if you make it too attractive to go in here, you lose over there. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. So in looking at a new way to get after all of this, and some of the discussions that I've had in the sidebar already today, up the front here talking to Mark and to Ruben around the success of, the Project Suakin, the CERCAT system, TWS. There's absolutely no doubt that that's laid a great foundation for us. When I get to participate in a National Reserve Forces Committee, a NATO committee, there's two things that NATO and other peers are really interested in from a reserve point of view from Australia. And the first is around our CERCAT system. They're just fascinated by it. And the second is none of them have, in recent times, actually executed a call out and seen how that worked out. So they always hit us up about those experiences. But the Project Suakin and all that was designed to be, I think it was a great conceptual advance. I don't think it's been optimised or maximised to what its potential was. I think there's more to do in that respect. There's a TWS component within Defence People Group who still have obligations annually to report to COSC on the state of TWS. So, that still exists. I think the work that comes out of the review here will in some ways build on that. And another example is, and I've got a version of it that I think that we can use particularly in the Navy and Air Force spaces, but I know that the 2nd Australian Division are also looking at a greater utility of existing policy, for example, around the use of Service Category 4, CERCAT 4. CERCAT 4 is a great opportunity for us in the sense that it can be linked to greater, shorter preparedness, readiness notations. But I think the idea that we want to move away from a casual-like commitment to a more defined and part-time-like commitment from our people is something that CERCAT 4 can help us with, because part of CERCAT 4 is a commitment to a training obligation, which therefore has to be mapped out a year in advance, and having that two-way certainty where, not only do we therefore expect to have a higher participation rate out of that group, what we're offering them back is greater certainty about what their training commitment actually is, and I think that's all goodness. Anyway, so I think that it's certainly worth building on the TWS in order to pick up its potential. That takes us on to something of an understanding of, well, how do we conceptualise what the reserve actually is? And got to pause here to acknowledge work done in the UK and in Canada. We've both come up with a 3-tiered structure before we did. This is our version of it, which for obvious reasons ends up in more or less the same place, but with slightly different tweaks for our context. But I don't know that up till now we've had a picture of what the reserve actually is. If your experience is ab initio as an Army reservist into 2nd Australian Division, that tends to be your world and that's what you think the reserve's about. if you were permanent Air Force and you get out and you come back in as one of those 3,000 folk doing lots of work back in BAU, you'll have a completely different idea about what the reserve workforce is. This structure seeks to try and understand each of the component parts to it, and I'll be upfront with you, we did this to conceptualise it, and then to get to, well, where do we think we need to go, we then mapped that against the 5 domains to see where we had an effect, where we didn't have an effect, or where we had an effect that needed some work on it. And it's not hard to see, but I'll go through it with you. So at the individual level, they are those people, as I said, probably in CIRCAT 3, probably ex-permanent force, occupying a desk in a full-time organisation, providing valuable service, and that needs to continue because a whole bunch of things wouldn't happen if it did. But we need to know that that's what it is. We need to know, for example, that a great cohort within that are likely to start to age out in the next few years, and the cohort that comes behind them won't necessarily have the same incentive out of their superannuation schemes that the present cohort does. So there's some issues as to what that's going to look like going forward. But it's a valuable contribution. We need to understand it, and we need to support it and plan for it. The operational level, for many of you, with the second division sort of experience, that's the classic example of an organisation built largely, but not exclusively, around a reserve component where, in the old money, we're going to raise, train, sustain a capability built around a reserve FE effectively. Of course, 2 divisions isn't the only example, so pick any others, 1 commander regiment, a lot of logistics, even in niche effects, some of the aeromedical evacuation, like in Air Force, for example, very small, but that's an operational effect that probably fits in there. When we did run that over the 5 domains, yep, okay, Army's got a quite developed response to that, but where is the operational reserve for Navy, for Air Force, for cyber and space? And you can see the obvious answer to that question. It's lacking. The Navy and Air Force experience, of course, being some years ago, they previously had ab initio pathways into a reserve career, and they did have reserve units. And they've been on an interesting journey because having got rid of those reserve units and absorbed everything into the permanent force, they're actually, I think, now really well positioned to break back out of that mould, back into the concept of an ab initio raised operational reserve effect. Think tugboats, think combat support groups, pick a capability where we know we're vulnerable in terms of having an operational effect that's actually going to work in the theatre mission constructs that we're training to. And you can see that there's some big gaps there that could be addressed by an ab initio pathway. And without going into the specifics of the recommendation, that concept, in terms of the bigger knee-jerk reactions to all of this, that's one of the places that we really want to develop a new operational reserve effect. Contingent reserve, CIRCAT 2. CIRCAT 2 at the moment is just over 9,500 people. As I say, sometimes I over-egg the pudding in terms of my language, and I once described it as an amorphous blancmange. But what I mean by that is it's an unknown and unassured capability. Army had and other places have had initiatives in terms of ringing X number of CIRCAT 2s to see what you get. What you get in large proportion is getting told to stuff off. That's interesting in itself. So if we've got 9,500 people there, even though I didn't know this before I did the review, there is a way to transition out of service and not even be on CIRCAT 2. I didn't know you can do that, but you can. There's about 400 a year do that. But for everyone else, we almost need to divide them into CIRCAT 2 and CIRCAT 2.1 or something for those that are prepared to still talk to us and at least consider options and have discussion about how they might contribute. in any event, we get to the sort of numbers we have at 9,500 because there is a standing obligation, although you can get out of it, for a 5-year post-transition commitment that sees that roll through at about that sort of size of numbers. Given that scaling and expansion base were part of our TORs, and given that we're going to look to create some new bits of operational reserve, but they're going to be defined, where else are we going to get the sort of mass, because mass ultimately does count, and access to large numbers of skill sets should we have the need? Right. Well, originally we were going to call that the strategic reserve for that effect. I got in front of Minister Keogh and I briefed him on that, and he goes, Doug, strategic. And after the amorphous blancmange comment, he said, that doesn't sound very strategic. and I actually agreed with him. And I said, well, the Canadian model, when they describe what they call it strategic, because they have their version of the CIRCAT 2 post-transition folk, and then they have the next phrase after that says, and the rest of the population of Canada. Now, there is no appetite for that in this country. And so I agreed that what we're going to then constrain our thinking to is probably not a strategic reserve in that regard. It's a contingent reserve. But for a contingent reserve to be worth anything, we're going to have to do more to manage it, to understand it, and I would have thought, not the least of which is understanding those who've got some propensity to listen and work with us and do stuff. There's a right-hand edge to that. None of this really has been set in concrete at the moment. It will be a process of working out what we have the capacity to do in the PERS management space. And it may be that what we end up doing in terms of the better management of that is a little bit like, with our vehicles, fitted for but not with. So maybe we need to start a management process that, whilst not at the right-hand edge of what that could look like, and I'll touch on that in a moment, at least we've got a process, at least we're engaging, even if it's at the left-hand edge, of a phone call once a year. Hey dude, how you tracking? Have you got any new skill sets that we want to put on our database? Are you interested in any opportunities to come and work for us? Not this year, got a promotion, that's right. Maybe we'll talk about it next year. Sounds good, all right, talk to you then, bye. Right, that's probably the left-hand edge. The right-hand edge would be like what many of, as I said, peer nations are already doing, whereby, and talking to AVM Robinson, this is something that was grappled with Air Force some number of years ago. But, if you've got these people and you know broadly what their skill sets are, and we had the resources and the time to do it, imagine if we could, for all of these people, say, righto, there's a job in the Air Force AOC. We know that on mobilisation we're going to need another 200 folk in there to do the watchkeeping, et cetera, and you shadow post against that wartime establishment, 2 or 3 individuals to each post out of CIRCAT 2, and they know that, okay, if I'm mobilised, this is what I'm going to do. That could shape what their desire for training and any ability to do work in the meantime might be, so on and so forth. I don't know that we'll get to that. That might be the fitted with version of what managing CIRCAT 2 looks like. But at least if we set a framework that allows us to establish the basics, then I think, should situation change, should things become more pressing, we could maybe ramp up and move to another phase. Underpinned in all of that, you'll hear me talking about our HR systems and our workforce intelligence. Clearly, that's a key component that is going to support any of this. Joint project between Dave's team and myself, we've actually got those changes now currently on PM keys. So as in the last few weeks, you are able to go on, put in your industry sector, your ASCO job code, you can name your employer and you can tick a consent for communication. We've got to work some legal issues about whether it's direct or request, but it's there, and I encourage all serving members to get on and have a play on PM keys and fill that out. But that's the beginning of getting serious about understanding our workforce, our demographic and our capabilities. All right, so at the individual level, the reforms really are all going to be about how to better manage that. So talked about all those CERCAT 3s doing the jobs they want to do, and whilst I recognise that they are truly volunteers and they're only going to volunteer to do the things they want to do, I would have thought that with a bit of effort it's possible to have a negotiated outcome where Defence's liability and needs can at least be brought into the conversation to try and direct some of that effort to where we actually need it. Noting that we should sustain that and continue it, of course, that is a level of output from ADF reserves at that individual level, and it's all about this. But it requires a common and standardised approach. We don't have it. We don't have across the services even a common understanding of what our service categories are. We don't have a common pay system. There's a whole bunch of things that we haven't yet been able to regularise to have common processes, and clearly it makes no sense for that to be the position, and that's something that we need to absolutely work out. The operational level, I've really touched on a lot of this already, but I think the key components for the way forward are identifying a suitable pathway into creation of a capability that is linked to DSR priorities. So, for example, in the Army space, it might be long-range fires with HIMARS, or it might be littoral manoeuvre. We've talked about, combat support group for Air Force and that sort of thing. My method and madness, if you like, is that whilst the numbers that will start with will be relatively modest, because we've still got to recruit and process and get those people in whilst we do absolutely everything else. I could conceive of, if we get this right, and if we come back to the training in a moment, if we have an attractive pathway, so that's conditions of service, incentivising, combined with some of the learnings out of the Ready Reserve scheme in terms of creating actual capability that's going to make a difference, and morphing that into something that could sit potentially alongside the ADF gap year as an alternate way forward for a school leaver, for example. I could conceive it being basically a pilot program that creates a replicatable system should we need to spin up quicker and pick another capability and another one. And I think that's the key to it. Get the pathway right, get the mechanics right, prove the concept, tweak the incentivisation to make sure it is an effective alternate ADF offer, and should we hit all those marks and the need arise and the resources be there, you could then turn on another cohort to get after another capability, and I think that's the utility of that. And of course, whilst this won't, it's applicable to the land domain, and Army's got some views about how they might get after that and what that might be. Certainly Navy and Air Force absolutely identify the need for people and how they can use this. And in the cyber and space domain, whilst that is still very much maturing, that there is a huge flavour in Joint Capabilities Group for us to get after that. And in that respect, we're not waiting for government on this one. Talking to Robbo over here, we're just doing it and getting after it because it makes such sense to bolt on, to find that capability and have it available as soon as we practically can. The contingent level really just needs to not be that blancmange. It needs to be better known, better assured, and anything we can do in that space to make that better is a step forward. But there are a lot of them, and if we're going to make that cohort bigger, for example, changing the 5-year post-transition obligation to something that might rhyme with 10, you can imagine that there's a fair bit of work in managing potentially 20,000 people, and as I said, there's a scale of what that management could look like, but it's an important part to understanding what scaling and expansion might look like, even if there are always going to be questions about currency and preparedness, and I get that, but we all know in this room that the government is not in this country going to start conscripting anytime soon. So where else are we going to get where can we turn to for mass to provide an expansion base? And even if, that CIRCAT 2 is, you might be a wing commander, but, you've learned how to drive a truck or a bus, you might come in as a bus driver. Look, in extremis, you've got to do what you've got to do. And at the moment, those folk are subject to call out, and I don't think we could ignore them, and certainly that's the theme that we've taken up. So, back to particularly the operational reserve piece. What, in simple terms, we're trying to explain here is a general mission, no real change there other than the changes that will apply across the board to our recruitment process that you heard General Fox talk about. The specialist pathway, we do need to do better there. Again, that's an example of where we don't have common processes across the system. We don't have the agility that we need to have to bring people in as mid-career entry, recognising their skill sets and what we need to do, and we need to do better there. And then an accelerated pathway, which is really that pilot program about how we can potentially create cohorts of capability, directed to do certain things and to test those waters and see if we can get that up and running. Anyway, so that's basically what I was saying there. I touched on training, and here, whilst the review doesn't purport to get down in the weeds about course should look like this or look like that, but at the conceptual level, I think you can take a lot from OPCUDO and Ukraine in extremis. They'll take a mother of three with no prior military experience out of Kyiv, 5-week UK Reserve Rifleman's course, and then issued bayonet and grenades and off you go, right? So that's what you do in extremis. I don't think we're at that point, but can we afford, let's say fictitiously take a HIMARS rocket system operator. Does that person first have to be trained on mortars, then on the 777s, and be an artillery bombardier before they can get anywhere near driving and deploying a HIMARS system? I wouldn't have thought so. The Americans front-end load a bit of training for a month or so, and then they maintain that capability on 35 days a year. Right? So there's an example of where we probably need to jettison old think, where it's linear. You've got to have done this to build on that, and blah blah blah. And so 15 years before you can get to that point. And we see how that hurts us, particularly in the reserve, particularly around some of our technical trades, signals, engineers, those sort of things, where we just can't get people into positions of responsibility and develop them and advance them because, oh no, you've got to get qualified in every single one of these things. Well, do you? I don't know that you do. And I think, the penny's starting to drop, that we need to learn perhaps more from the American sort of training system rather than where we've come from, and not everyone needs the breadth and depth that you might put some cohort through. So I think it's fine. You're going through RMC, you come out as a lieutenant but capable in a company commander. That's an example of breadth and depth that's probably worthwhile. But if you're going to be a HIMARS operator or a small boat handler, maybe you don't. So I'll leave that with you. But that allows us to have a training paradigm that's going to be much closely linked to the actual output we want and much more suitable to a reservist doing in a shorter period of time. So administration, career management, look, it's obvious we don't have in all of the services the same even career management that if you're an Army CIRCAT 5 you currently do. We need to fix that. We don't have the people or the resources in the military personnel organisation just yet to do that, so there's a resource build to it. We need to find across the organisation all the little pockets of reserve career management, shake the tree, find all those people and probably redeploy them into a collective effect that's more centralised. Conditions of service. Look, absolutely all know that our conditions of service aren't really fit for purpose, and it's really by stint of goodwill and grace that I think we have the reserve that we do, and they continue to serve. I get it that there's perennial discussion around the big ticket issues like the divisor, like super, tax, non-tax, those sort of things. You'll be aware that a few in the room here, like Mike Carmes and Renee, had a lot to do with the focus group study that we did at the end of last year. And some of the key learnings that came out of that were around the agency point that Mike talked about earlier, in terms of, does everyone need to be on the exact same package, or is it possible to sort of elect, depending on where you are in your stage of life? And I think that that's something we need to work towards. The reality of this, firstly, it is not possible in the scope of the time that we had in the review to solutionise this. So do not expect to read in the review, and here's all the measures that we need to have to make reserve pay work. That's not what you're going to see. The need for it, absolutely identified. And then going forward, we've already started the process of engaging with the policy folk in DPG to get after that and land that. I know that we're going to be met with some choices around, do we grab the half-developed policies and develop those and land those, or do we hold off and do the holistic thing, or do I try and do both? So there's going to be a little bit of grappling with all of that. My sense is that the number of newsletters and updates that come out on the defence system that only talk to permanent force and no reservists can see themselves in any of those updates probably means that we need to land something sooner rather than later where reservists can start seeing some initiatives that actually speak to them. And when I attended Dave's headquarters and command group, I was warned to wear my Kevlar about that issue, and they didn't disappoint. Nearly there, guys. Look, key risks and issues. We are going to fight a priority war, right? There's absolutely no two ways about it. When I talk to General Craig Dobson around, hey, look, my right-hand edge of CIRCAT 2 and the blood drained from his face, trying to think about what that means in terms of understanding establishment. He says, Doug, I've got 2 years of capability reviews already lined up. When exactly am I going to get to that? And it's that kind of reality about, okay, I get it, but that leads me to maybe it's a phased approach to something like that, where if we can set up the mechanism, knowing that, look, if the shooting starts and we've got to get serious really quickly, that we've already thought about what we need to potentially do next. So priorities across defence will be an issue. General Fox's approach to help us land this is to bring these initiatives in under part of the strategic workforce plan, which has its own race to run, its own miles to meet and accountabilities. And I think it's probably right that being hitched to something that it's at the very top end strategic as a vehicle will help us carry forward with that momentum. I would envisage that there will be a series of directives, joint directives, that will tell us how to get after that. In the meantime, I'll just finish off on this. So obviously the people issues around recruitment are really the same across the board, but it's really, as I say, the priority battle amongst everything else that's changing, which is where the rub's going to be. So implementation, Brett Challoner down the back here. Brett was on the review team with us, very fortunate to have him, and very fortunate to be able to have him and Rogan over there doing some work with me for the rest of this year while I've got them. And then I would see I'm going to build an enduring effect out of my division, not only to continue the rollout of the implementation, but to actually contribute to holding DPC, Defence People Committee, and various other organisations that have a say in this, to just keep that iron in the fire post even the rollout of all of this. Look, I'll pause there, Michael, to take any questions. I know I've probably gone a little bit over time. I just couldn't talk any quicker.
No, that's all right. And I'll give you a break, General Doug, and thank you, first of all. I might give you a spell for a moment and ask you to sit down. Because there's a couple of things I want to say around the engagement that we had as a Defence Reserves Association in the process, and just make a couple of observations as well around the input and the themes that General Doug has expanded on this morning. And I know we might intrude a little bit into lunchtime, but I think it's important. But as long as you know, the hard shoulder is 13:30 when we return from lunch. So we'll break when I say we're going to break. So, look, I just wanted to make a couple of quick points. We were very well engaged during the process of the review. To some extent, we were injecting ourselves in there, but we wanted to be heard, and I believe we were. And we had the benefit of being able to come together for, not necessarily only for this reason, but as it turned out, it was a happy coincidence. We came together as a DRA National Executive in Melbourne for a couple of days in late January, and that chimed in very well with, in terms of sequencing, the fact that there was a 2-day workshop to kick the process off for Brett and for Doug and the rest of the review team. And we certainly felt well able to participate in that workshop. And then as Doug went through those key milestones, particularly the briefings to COSC, at almost every juncture, we found a time for Doug to brief the DRA National Executive at one or other of our monthly meetings on that process and how it had gone and next steps. So we were, as I say, well engaged and very appreciative of that process. There are many themes that Doug's touched on, which also I'm pleased to say resonate with those things that we ultimately put in a submission through Doug to the review team. And in that article, which was on most people's chairs when you sat down, that's been an abridged form, but you've seen, and I hope you see, if you have a chance to read that a lot of those recommendations that are in there, which is a distillation, if you like, of many of the things that we mentioned in our submission, as I say, they find a birth to a greater or lesser degree in terms of some of the things that Doug's touched on. And ultimately, we, the DRA, believe there are obviously 3 compelling imperatives as to why we need a strong, a capable and a well-resourced reserve component. Firstly and most obviously, and Doug's touched on all of these, to sustain the force in conflict. If in the worst of worlds we find ourselves in a shooting war that is going to mid or high intensity, then we know certain things will happen. Planes will be shot down, ships will be sunk, women and men will die in close combat. Those things will happen. And in order to sustain the force through that, and we only have a defence force to win the nation's wars, we need a sustainable and resilient defence force. And in those sorts of scenarios, we need a reserve to provide a degree of that resilience and sustainment. As has been mentioned already by Natasha Fox and also by Doug, we also know that even in our BAU practices, there is an operational necessity for the reserve component to contribute and continue to contribute fulsomely. And of course that will only expand with new domains of cyber and space and other specialisations where no one pretends that we will grow those capabilities ab initio within the permanent force. So we need the reserve for that as well. Thirdly, and I think General Fox touched on this a little bit as well, and of course as we turn the blancmange into something more tangible like a sponge or a bun, something that we can serve portions of as we need it, we know that as people stay engaged with defence as they leave CERCAT 7, that's a good thing for their well-being. And we know that there'll be lots of recommendations from the Royal Commission in the Defence and Veteran Suicide Report that will touch on that theme. So we need the ability of more people, quite apart from the operational and capability perspective, the more people that we can incentivise to serve on in one of the other service categories after CERCAT 7. For many of those people, not for all, but for many, that'll also be a godsend in terms of their well-being down the track. So 3 pretty compelling reasons there, I would have thought. So on that note, I'll stop, but I just wanted to get those issues out there from an association perspective. And on that basis, I'll take some questions and maybe the General will be kind enough to rejoin me. And I am conscious of the fact that, as I said earlier, we didn't get all the questions that inevitably would have been asked of General Fox. So with the General's indulgence, happy to take some of those as well, so long as they are purely from a reserve perspective. I think people would understand that. So, okay.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Doug, you talked about the cliff of those people who are on the old super schemes who provide that service. Do you have a view of what that looks like in the sort of timeline that will use? And what is the cliff like?
It's a fair whack of that 2,000.
Right. Because I think that's really important in the context of the living that you're
Correct.
doing. Yeah.
And look, you know, we've got, it's like a learned dependency. You know, we've addressed hollowness through, you know, a fortuitous situation of those people being able to be incentivised to come back in. But yeah, it's the fact that they're going to hit that point, they'll all hit CRA over a couple of years, and we're going to lose a great whack of that contribution. It's not, how do you replace that? Because, you know, we're already struggling to grow the permanent force to do the functions that they're currently doing.
What do you reckon, Richie? 2 years?
Yep, I think 2 years.
I'll come to an online question in a moment. There was one from Greg Mellick and then another one over here. Greg?
When we started what became Suakin, it was quite obvious one of the big problems was the pay tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
And what I was trying to do was unshackle it so that you could pay a reservist who delivered the capability you needed rather than having all the capabilities you were supposed to have because of the pay scales, including familiarity with running 16 range practices when only had ammunition for 2.
Yeah, yep.
Came to the conclusion the only way it could be done was legislatively, because the remuneration committee would always shackle it. Have you come up with a solution to that?
Short answer, Greg, no. It is true that our process will start us with, I guess, a conceptual policy, but then we're going to have to run, absent a legislative intervention, that would see us running the gamut of the tribunal to get a new pay system up. So that is future ops, and I haven't solutionised that just yet. But it sounds like I might give you a call, right?
You still can talk about that.
I like the way you're thinking.
Question from the back of the room, and then I'll take one online.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Tim Orders down at 9 Brigade. We've heard a lot about the total workforce system today, and General Fox spoke about the Batman diagram, that mobility through the CERCATs, and we're going to hear from Commander of the 2nd Division about the very specific role and mission that the 2nd Division now has. I guess I wonder whether the use of the term reserves is still relevant, given the focus and the effects that what we're calling our reserves are providing every day in a very focused and delivered form.
Tim, thanks for the question. And look, I've had certainly the last CDF raise that exact thing with me in the middle of a briefing. I was able to respond with, well, we looked at this in the Joint Reserve Working Group a year or so ago, and whilst we resolved what we thought was an answer that is not authoritative, and it might be a damn good topic for the DRA to grapple with. But my own view, and I'm not really wedded to an outcome, is that within the enterprise, at least for currently serving, we understand the language of CERCAT. So, you know, if we're talking about CERCAT 3 as opposed to 5, we know what that means, broadly. When we talk outside of defence, if we don't have the word reserve, what other word are we going to have? There's a brand issue, and if you get rid of the word reserve, what are you going to replace it with? Territorial or part-timer or... Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But there's a cost there and an opportunity, I suppose. The opportunity as to why you might change it is, you know, do we feel it's divisive within the organisation to have the naming convention of reserve? And you know, there's been, you know, predecessors to General Tomei that have been really wedded to not talking about reserve but talking about part-time component, blah, 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 blah. For my money, I don't mind being called a reservist. I've been known as that for, you know, nearly 40 years, and I'm comfortable with it. I don't feel any lesser for it. But I accept that it's a naming convention that some might feel it's connotes something lesser. But I don't know that there's an easy answer to what you replace it with. And then you've got to build the brand up again when you do get another word. And if you look at, again, overseas experience, the UK used to have territorials, they now have reservists. So it's got an international connection. So the Americans use reserve, the Brits use reserve, Canada uses reserve, Kiwis use reserve. I don't know. Open for suggestions, but that's where I've landed on it.
Our view is it's a recognised nomenclature. As long as we internal to Defence know what we're talking about, then that's fine. I think it's part of the narrative of the communication to the community at large about the reserve. It's a time-honoured term. Those who serve in the reserve are proud to serve in the reserve. Many of those people have also formally served in the permanent force or the regular force, if you like, depending upon your branch of service. We're all good with that. I think we would abandon it at our peril, to be honest, to try and come up with a term which would also have its detractors, no matter what that term might be. So at the moment,
seem to be aligned.
The association's perspective, which I've just put together, is that we stick with a reserve.
Nice tap shoes.
Okay, look, there is maybe we've already answered this online question. If there are changes that you can, I think we have. If there are changes to reserve pay as part of the review, any idea how many years it would take to go through DFRT? Noting focus on speed to capability, reduced red tape, etc.
Yeah, look, I think it's similar to question to what Greg's was, and I acknowledge that is going to be a hard road to get to the fullness of that. But I'll say to you, in this forum, there is low-hanging fruit out there, and there are people who have already been working stuff up. That one of the options would be: do we grab what we can and get it through whilst it's all a thing? The risk with that approach is that other people then sit back and go, well, that's done, all right? And it would be up to people like me to keep saying, no, it's not done. That was just what we grabbed as the low-hanging. But as I said before, I think the environment is pretty ripe for getting some wins on the board, some announcements that reservists can see themselves in as part of these big initiatives that are incentivising the whole of the workforce. So I'm probably leaning towards grab what we can while we can.
I'll come back to one we've got online, but yeah.
Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Gordon, Army Reserve Medical Corps. There's one extra group of people I'd be appreciative if you'd think about, and you made a complex subject even more complicated by questions from the audience. You have a group of people in the audience and the community who are semi-retired, engineers, dentists, doctors, nurses, people whose expertise can use not at the front line but at the base camps, instructing on medical skills, instructing on engineering skills, instructing on this. I'll talk to you about it afterwards and expand, sir.
Yeah, I know where you're coming from. It's part of the aperture around, and look, I won't steal Ken's thunder, but if we're talking about a cyber reserve, for example, does every one of those cyber warriors have to be capable of being pushed out of an aircraft? I don't know that they do. They might be excellent, industry leaders nationally, Monday to Friday, working, behind a computer at a desk. Why can't they do that, from a wheelchair if necessary in cyber? So, anyway, point taken.
Yes.
Ken Broadhead, RUSI. The concepts are very impressive and detailed, but it seems to me that if we suddenly had a big fright in Australia from another power, or an ally required us to deploy substantial force overseas and sustain it, we'd be in trouble. I mean, what sort of surge could all of this cope with if it were necessary? It's all happening nice and logically, but if a push came to a real shove, how would we fare?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and it's one that troubles me a lot, quite frankly. Noting the security clash and we're talking to at the official level, but broadly, there's sort of three conceptual theatre missions that we think about. We think about broadly, defence of the homeland, and then there's variations on some expeditionary stuff that we might have to get into. At a level, with the 2nd Australian Division already allocated its mission, do we have any expansion base left that's a reserve contribution at all? And arguably we don't. We've actually already committed it. So we don't have anything to expand to. The only way we have something to expand to is if in that concept of what our potential theatre missions might be, that government will be presented with options that we can't do 1 and 2 or 1 and 3 or 1, 2 and 3. We can do 1 or we can do 2 or we can do 3. And if the government only has limited options, it can then redeploy what otherwise would have been for example, the 1st Australian Division might be looking at expeditionary warfare, but if the fight's all at home, they would reinforce David's team, for example. And that's where you would get your reinforcement. But I agree, if we've got to do all of it, there are known and starting to crystallise vulnerabilities, for sure.
There's a question online here, and this is really probably one that would have been dealt with by Lieutenant General Fox, but there are... Can the Brave Child Champion Medallion, which some of you may not be aware of, but it recognises the challenges that some of our ADF children face with ADF parents. I notice Tisha's nodding her head. Could that possibly be expanded to include Service Category 5 personnel? And that's the question. I don't know.
I know the answer. Look, without promising anything, I had a meeting with the head of Defence Member and Family Support 2 weeks ago, along with my colleague Lara AVM Gunn, who heads up JSSD, and asked that exact question. So it's the Child of the ADF medallion, currently available to children of full-time serving members. Asked the question, well, I know there are different pressures on families, whether you're a family of a reservist or a family of a permanent force, but they're pressures nonetheless, and they're kids who do without parents while they're away on operation or exercises, whichever way you cut it. There was no pushback on that, and we'll have a detailed look at it. So, yeah, great question. Got it.
Heard it here first. That's a good one. And the next one is, will an unclassed version of this reserve review be accessible once government agrees, Slant doesn't agree, Slant agrees in principle on some of the recommendations?
Honest answer, I don't know. Government will tell us what they want to do with that. We didn't produce a glossy thing with lots of photos and pictures. We just produced a report. If we're told to create something for public consumption with pretty pictures and such, we'll do that. But to be honest, I don't know what the fate of it will be.
I'll come back. I'll give a couple of people in the room a go. Rob, then Paul.
Afternoon, General. Rob Lording. Look, we've had a review that, as I understand, the Minister held off signing the terms of reference for an extended period. You've been given a very abridged period to actually conduct it, where you haven't been able to solutionise. You'll deliver a report to government, which will then come to CDF and a defence force that is, I think, inundated and consumed with a range of different issues, anything from procurement, delivering on its integrated investment program, huge range of other structural changes, including all of the stuff that General Fox spoke about this morning. So the question I've got to you is, what is it? Why would the people in this room sit here and go, this report will be accepted, endorsed, actioned, and not just consigned to the dust heap of all of the other reserve reviews that have been conducted in the last 40 years? I'm blunt, but...
Look, Rob, I wish I could say, oh, that's crap, but I can't say that's crap, all right? Look, my sense is there are enough senior folk behind it that I don't think it'll go straight to the dustbin. I concede that ahead of us is a priority fight, both in terms of resources to actually plan it and then to pay for it and deliver it. We're floating new policy proposals to try and get funding for it, knowing that we'll get told no, do it out of hide, but we're having a crack just to make the point. So, you're not speaking rubbish. It will be a challenge. The challenge will lie not only in the priorities that I've indicated, but making sure that sufficient people are invested and behind it. I can say that, you've heard from Chief of Personnel today, General Fox is absolutely behind this. She's held my feet to the fire and extended me in the role to help make sure that we get after this and deliver it. But I know the reality is that across the whole organisation there are people that will accord this, not their lane, not really interested. And me and Brett and our small team can't do all the work. If we need stuff to be developed, it's, we might be the ringmasters. The actual work to develop new training paradigms, new pathways, new policy is going to be done by the people that own that on a day-to-day basis. There will be a joint directive telling them what to do. There will be a reporting and insurance mechanism that is our way of trying to cajole and make sure milestones are hit. CPERS reads absolutely everything I send her and still sends me RFIs 11 o'clock at night. I'm confident that her attention to detail will hold my feet to the fire likewise. So that's what we can offer to try and mitigate the very thing that you've pointed out.
Thanks, Doug. And I might say, as I've already said, we have been engaged well in this, and the Defence Reserves Association and its antecedent bodies have not always been so well engaged in previous reviews. This time we have, and as I said, many of the things that we said have found a place or a berth or a home in some of the recommendations. So we will be certainly active in once we cite the final version to hold government and defence to account for this. It's important that we do. Paul, you had a question?
Paul Simidas, Brigadier Lording asked my question, so another one. Oh. Total workforce. I've been at Talisman Sabre, where contractors and ABS provide services as diverse as aeromedical evacuation, umpire control, and even discrete enablement of new capabilities. And UAVs are flown by have been flown by contractors. They're potential reservists. Is that valid? Do you think that we need to have a broader approach to this whole business?
Look, yes, I do, and I think one of the points that AVM Robinson has got to talk about will take us to that interaction between the concept of reserve service. And it can be a pretty broad concept. Like there's other models other than joining your local depot in terms of what a shared workforce between a civilian capability and a uniform capability, how that could come about. So I won't steal Ken's thunder. He can touch on that. But their answer is developing a closer and deeper partnership with industry, particularly defence industry, academia, these sort of things. Definitely is the future to be able to understand how that's going to contribute to mobilisation and expansion in particular.
Another question online. The total workforce system enjoyed a period to facilitate flexible service with position numbers created to facilitate employment and reactivation of CIRCATs 2 through 5. This is no longer the case with strict position number requirements. Can we facilitate that?
Yeah, look...
that's a... fairly.
Tish, have you got...
Tish, yeah. So the question was, it was casting back to when, I think in the early days of TWS, there was a period where it was facilitating flexible service. So position numbers were being created to match perhaps individuals in terms of their future employment and reactivation into CIRCAT 2 and 5. So it asserts that that's no longer the case with strict position number requirements. I'm not sure whether that's the case or not, but can we...
Yeah, ERPs... Look, there will be some challenges with that. So, one position, one pay, etc. The new sort of philosophy in the ERP system that we're coming on to will challenge some of that. And, even to the point where many reservists work for more than one part of the organisation, all of that, I think we're yet to kind of bash into place and work through. Tish, have you got anything else?
Yeah, they took away double heading positions. They took away full positions because of the ERP.
Yeah.
So you do have individual position numbers are required.
Yeah.
And the military workforce design team create those positions, and it's limited, as part of that workforce structure. So we haven't got the flexibility we had.
No. So I suspect there will be a period of evolution as we grapple with that, but the questioner has raised a valid issue that will be a bit of a challenge for a while.
Well recognised.
Yep.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, can we eat now, sir?
We can. We will resume at 13:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.